But maybe those men weren't so different than people today. You see, it seems that history demonstrates that for any long-lived government, ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, the history of our mother country, England, there is a time when the system needs to reboot. That's a modern analogy, but it works. Because the natural course of corruption, human nature, greed, covetousness, and the obsessive impulse to power and control get to such a level that the people suffering under it demand that problems be redressed. That was the condition we had here in this country when Jefferson penned those words. Here are some different words. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, obviously here, Abraham Lincoln is echoing Jefferson. He said, now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. You see, sometimes, historically, the rebooting is bloody and violent. Many people are hurt or killed, property and wealth are destroyed, lives are ruined. And ironically, it's often in times of struggle that true leaders with tremendous character arise and are remembered by history. It's also a time when the achievements of the past are in jeopardy of either being destroyed or being ruined. And we see this in Lincoln's last line in the Gettysburg Address, which really wasn't very long. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that we here highly resolved that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Again, echoing some of the sentiments brought up by Jefferson. Now, there are some problems with Lincoln, as you might know. Lincoln did things which started us down the road towards the constitutional issues we're in today. But his words hold true. It was a time when America came into a crisis. And unknown to most Americans today, America is truly entering another time of crisis for reasons which I'd like to elaborate, but which most people don't suspect. And although there is some awakening on both sides of the aisle, which we'll call it, Democrats and Republicans, they both sense that something is wrong, but both sides are tending to blame the opposite side for the problem rather than realizing two very important realities in this whole situation. Number one, both Republicans and Democrats have contributed in large measure to creating this problem that we're now going to have to deal with, namely shredding the provisions contained in the Constitution. And number two, that they're being steered to a third destination which neither of the sides seems to suspect, and that they're becoming unwitting pawns in that type of system and situation. This is interesting because both the left and the right are being manipulated in many cases by some of the powers that be out there, even as they squabble over their controversies with each other. This third destination is one which many of the think tanks have clearly talked about. It's been discussed widely in academic literature, in government-sponsored think tanks, roundtable forums, and yet very few people have paid much attention to it over the years. So if people on the left or the right do suspect that something's going on, they tend to blame it on the other side, rather than understanding that there's sort of a third party in the mix. In essence, our form of government is being altered without the consent of the governed. We are being merged into new international unions whose unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats are determining our future without our consent or even our ability to achieve redress when we dissent from their decisions or their demands upon us. When we hear terms such as public-private partnerships without understanding what these truly mean, we're falling victim to that. Various sections of government are implementing the terms of international treaties despite the fact that our Senate never ratified these treaties. These people even want to impose taxes upon us without consent. So these two things, the shredding of the Constitution and the remaking of our form of government, are the real issues of this election, not the ones necessarily being debated by either the Republicans or the Democrats. Only every so often do you hear a voice like Ron Paul's who occasionally hits it right on the nose for some of the issues that we are confronting and we'll talk about tonight. And both of these issues are going to be subsumed and involved in the series of difficult times which we are going to be facing as a country in the next 48 months for reasons, again, that most of the candidates are not addressing. Have you noticed the change in the subject of the debates in just the last 2 months? A radical shift in the whole focus to what? Economics. They weren't even talking about this 2 months ago. They were talking about free health care, and never was there a mention of the problem with the Social Security situation, or rarely was there a mention of this nature. And all of a sudden the shift went, well, what caused that shift? Well, it was a little thing called a subprime mortgage debacle. I call it a subcrime mortgage debacle, all right? Alan Greenspan didn't see it coming. I thought, that's strange. He's the chairman of the Federal Reserve. I mean, at the Financial Sense News Hour, we started talking about it in January of last year. One of the predictions we made in our first program, which is what Jim and I do every year, is to make predictions. And the prediction was we were going to have a serious currency crisis sometimes by the middle of 2007 as the housing market rolled over and all of those adjustable rate mortgages that back in 2003 Alan Greenspan urged everyone to get into to keep the economy going, to keep that housing bubble rolling. When that thing blew, suddenly everybody was going to be left with all of this problematic debt. So we were talking about in January, in May of 2007, when everybody in the markets were screaming and yelling in glee and joy because the markets were hitting new heights, Jim called me and says, it's looking downright ugly out there, it's going to blow. And very shortly after that, it blew. And then all of the hand-wringing, oh my, what are we going to do about this? That's just the beginning of what Jim is calling, and I have to give him credit for this, he's written about this on his website, the perfect financial storm. It's going to be a collision of a whole series of different problems, any one of which would be serious in and of itself. But combined, they're going to be breathtaking. Number one, we're going to enter a very serious energy crisis sometime between 2009 and 2012. The bottom line is, given our aging infrastructure worldwide and the increasing demand for oil, we can no longer provide the entire world with all of the oil that it demands, especially with the growth in China and India. Now, bear in mind that we're entering this energy crisis at the same time the people on other issues are saying we've got to cut back, we've got to do things because of global warming. These two things, counterbalanced with the economy, they're not solvable together in the way that they've been proposed. They're warring against each other. So we keep talking about cutting back our CO2 emissions, and I say don't even think about it. It's just not going to happen. Because as soon as the American people begin to feel the pain that this causes, notably in the pocketbook, they're not going to put up with it. I don't care if the world fries. They won't put up with it. It's just not going to sell at the polls. So that's one crisis. The second crisis is we're going to have more economic crises like the one we have. Keep looking on the horizon. One of the next events is going to be credit default swaps, which is nothing but an extension of the subprime mortgage issue. The baby boomers begin retiring this year. This is the third issue. Do you realize that in the Social Security Trust Fund, and I bet most of you do because it's one of Ron Paul's main themes, there are $0. There's just IOUs. And some people will say, oh yes, but those are Treasury notes. And they're guaranteed by the full faith and government of the credit of the U.S. government. Okay. And who backs up the full faith and credit of the U.S. government when it comes time to pay these? You do. The taxpayers, right. So the taxpayer is guaranteeing that the taxpayer will be paid. This is not going to fly. Professor Larry Kotlikoff at Boston University estimates the real-world deficit in Social Security to be somewhere, the number keeps going up, but at least $51 trillion, somewhere over the next 10 years or something like that in real world. This is an impossible number. I mean, the national debt, depending on who you read, is only floating above 10 somewhere and getting a little higher.